Hi, this is my lecture on Civil War and Reconstruction. So this past week, we've read about women and men trying to assert what they believed were their natural rights. Remember, we looked very closely at Maria Stuart and the manifesto that came out of the Seneca Falls Convention. People had an idea of what they believed were their natural rights. For Stuart, it came out of her deep love and devotion of God, her Christianity. The men and women who supported Seneca Falls had different notions. Perhaps it was also a Christian obligation, or they simply believed that women should have rights to property. In other words, interpretation is what drives Americans. And I think we still have those kinds of debates today. So for this week, I really want you to think about how interpretation can be tricky, how interpretation of the Constitution, the interpretation of the Emancipation Proclamation, could allow Blacks to still be considered racially inferior after they were freed from slavery. And this is a part of our history that, again, is now tradition. We still have the same kinds of debates over things like abortion, immigration, women's rights, even today. So think about how interpretation really affects our lives, our history. So up until 1868, the U.S. Constitution made no distinctions based on gender. On voter qualifications, it said that the electors in each state should have the qualifications requisite for electors of the most numerous branch of the state legislature. So basically, before 1868, women did not get the vote, we know, until 1920, but states could allow female voters if it was in their state constitution. But in 1868, the 14th Amendment introduced the word male. And so now it no longer allowed states the wiggle room to give certain women the right to vote. And we'll talk more about this later. When the Civil War ended, and in 1865, the 13th Amendment formally ended slavery, a complex struggle over its meaning had just begun. The amendment did not address equality or forbid racial hierarchy. So wouldn't it be nice to have an amendment that said, be nice to each other, be kind, don't be racist? But we can't. And even though this amendment clearly forbade slavery, it was just the beginning of a whole set of problems for Black communities. Okay, so between 1860 and 1870, Blacks in Atlanta increased from 1,900 to 10,000. So from 20% of the overall population to 46%. And a large majority of these were Black women. Most acquired jobs as household workers. Some had acquired these skills as house slaves. And during this time, the term Reconstruction can be applied literally. Greedy contractors lusted after the physical rebuilding of cities and hastily built poorly constructed huts and shanties for newly freed people. Food and other consumer goods, like the huts, were scarce, of poor quality, and grossly overpriced. So this is the scene here where you have a major catastrophe. The South was destroyed by civil war. And during this time of Reconstruction, you had people sort of taking advantage of one another. White yeoman farmers, so the small farmers, not the plantation owners, but the farmers who were poor and barely getting by, they also had to flee to the cities because there was no work. And so in 1860, there were about 7,600 whites in Atlanta, and by 1870, there were just under 12,000, 11,900. As small landowners, they couldn't sustain their rural lifestyle. Same reason why, just in general, women and children had to look to cities. Widows of soldiers, elderly single women, wives of the unemployed as well as the employed, wives whose men went out to work and these men just kept going and never came back. And these were both Black and white women, immigrant women, etc., etc. So I know this is a very rosy picture, but there was some relief by the federal government, but there was nothing to prepare this really newbie nation, right? This is only the 1860s here. There was nothing in place that could really organize the relief. Cities lacked resources and the ambition to create agencies of human services. The federal government did create the Freedmen's Bureau. It was established in 1865. So right away, the federal government tried, but it was not very effective. The Freedmen's Bureau was supposed to help ex-slaves find work and also protect Black rights. So the federal government knew that overnight, at the snap of fingers, that racism wouldn't subside, that life would magically change for these ex-slaves. And so they tried to create an agency that would try to protect Blacks. But it couldn't anticipate the overwhelming need. There was so much help that was needed. It tried to stem migration, establish order, restore the economy. So they basically sort of tried to limit the people who entered cities. It's sort of like, going into a market nowadays where you have to kind of stay in line and kind of wait your turn to get in. The Freedmen's Bureau ended up having to evict a lot of ex-slaves from contraband camps, started pushing them towards the edges of towns. And these camps often suffered a disease such as smallpox epidemics. There was one at the end of 1865 because the tents were crowded and unheated. There wasn't great sanitation and so forth. But despite all of this, everything, cities were your best bet. They offered protection from the uncertainties of rural backwoods and an optimistic future based on economic self-sufficiency. Newly free people building their lives as independent workers. This was the theme in cities. Black men were mostly offered unskilled and service labor despite opportunities in industrialized cities. Railroad workers during the day groomed roads, distributed the crushed stones you often see on railroads, shoveled snow off tracks. Brakemen coupled and uncoupled stationary cars, and this entailed running along the roof of moving trains to apply the brakes. So there was no just stepping on a pedal. You had to actually physically get up there to stop a train. And had the same kinds of jobs as well. They worked in small manufacturing plants, such as those that made candy, clothing, textiles, paper boxes, book binding, straw goods, etc., etc. Black women were confined to domestic labor in homes as cooks, maids, and child nurses, often the tasks they had when they were slaves. Some worked in hotels, which was a step up from domestic work. You felt as if you were a professional. A large number opted to be laundresses at home to do people's laundry and take clean clothes back to these individual families. Skilled jobs such as seamstressing, dressmaking were the most desirable, and of course, teaching was the most desirable of all. Now, I tell you all of this because there was a new work culture that made employers and employees have to adjust to this new world. Black women who felt work that started to emulate slave labor would protest or abandon these jobs altogether. For example, and these are all cases that have been recorded, an employer asked his laundry worker to do more work after dinner, and she refused based on the fact that she was tired. She was basically delineating her idea of a fair work day for 30 cents a day. Another example, when an employer added cooking and washing to a Black woman's work burden when the regular cook had departed, the woman feigned illness on ironing days and later quit altogether. So as you could imagine, being newly freed, you were very hesitant to be treated like a slave again, right? Black women quit over grievances such as low wages, long hours, ill treatment, and unpleasant tasks. Now, this confused employers who thought that Blacks were in great need of work. They chalked it up to Blacks being unreliable, perhaps not smart enough. For Black women, however, this was a strategy to gain some control and power over their labor and their lives. When a woman gained a reputation for good work and reliability, she was sought after. So, for example, Hannah, a cook and a washer, was being pursued by this woman named Virginia Shelton. Hannah was able to negotiate about $8 a month for herself and then $10 for her husband, because the original and going offer was $5 and $8. So when you had a reputation, you could use that to your advantage as well. The offer was accepted since Shelton made such an effort to get Hannah. Southern employers blamed Black labor mobility on some sort of racial deficiency combined with subversive influence of Northerners. So in a lot of ways, the antebellum days of the South, feeling there was a conspiracy against them, still remained. Frustrated employers turned to the Freedmen's Bureau to complain about what they perceived was fickleness. The Bureau did little to help, mainly because it was understaffed. So the Southerners decided instead to turn to local government. And local government decided to enact laws against idleness and vagrancy as prosecutable offenses. For example, the Black Codes of 1865 in Atlanta obstructed Black laborers' full participation in the marketplace and political arena. So remember, if you hearken back to the colonial days and remember the laws that started to prohibit and limit Black participation, well, we're seeing it all over again. In 1866, the Atlanta City Council passed a law requiring employers to solicit recommendations from previous jobs in order to distinguish the worthy from the worthless laborers. So this was again ex-slave owners and those who supported slavery trying to take control over Black lives.